The night was black, the sea alive with shadows. Somewhere in the Solomon Islands, Japanese destroyers crept along a narrow channel, confident in their power. They were the hunters. But in the silence, a faint hum began to rise. Within seconds, streaks of white water cut across the waves. Torpedoes slammed into the dark hulks, fire erupting against the night sky. The hunters had become the hunted. And the weapons that struck terror into Japan's proud navy? Not battleships. Not aircraft carriers. But fragile wooden boats, barely 80 feet long, powered by gasoline engines that roared like thunder, and crewed by young men who had been told their chances of survival were slim. These were America's Patrol Torpedo Boats. The Mosquito Fleet. Small, fast, and armed with a sting that Japan had not expected. They made up less than 1% of the U.S. Navy. Yet time and again, they darted from hidden coves, striking supply convoys, barges, and destroyers before vanishing back into the black waters of the Pacific. The Japanese called them devils of the night. But how could boats built of plywood, boats that some U.S. commanders dismissed as suicide machines, end up haunting the Imperial Navy? What made these craft so dangerous that even Japanese officers admitted they attacked like phantoms? And what role did they play in a war dominated by giant battleships and vast carrier fleets? This is the story of America's secret PT boats. A story of ingenuity, daring, and survival. A story where courage often outweighed firepower. And a story that left the Japanese stunned, not by size, but by speed, nerve, and shadows. War in the Pacific was never a battle of equals. At the outbreak of hostilities in 1941, Japan's Imperial Navy was one of the most experienced, disciplined, and technically advanced naval forces on Earth. Its battleships and cruisers patrolled with an aura of invincibility, and its aircraft carriers had just proved their power with the stunning attack on Pearl Harbor. Against this backdrop, America searched for any edge it could find. Industry could deliver carriers and battleships in time, but war could not wait. Every day after Pearl Harbor saw Japan surging deeper into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. U.S. forces on the ground and sea were outnumbered, outgunned, and, in many cases, outmaneuvered. It was here, in the desperate early months, that the United States turned to an unproven weapon, the Patrol Torpedo Boat. The idea was simple in theory, radical in practice. Take a small, fast craft, barely 80 feet in length, built not of steel but of plywood, and arm it with torpedoes normally carried by destroyers. Give it machine guns, depth charges, and rocket launchers. Then unleash it against enemy shipping in the dead of night. The Navy had tested designs through the late 1930s, but many admirals scoffed. What use could there be for suicide boats that would be shredded by a single shell? Some even dismissed them as little more than glorified pleasure craft. But in the shadow of Japan's dominance, the gamble was approved. By 1940, contracts went out to companies like Elco and Higgins Industries. The first PT boats rolled off production lines just months before war broke out. They were marvels of speed, 3 Packard engines driving them to over 40 knots, faster than nearly anything else afloat. Their weapons were unconventional, for 21-inch torpedoes slung along the sides, twin .50 caliber machine guns, and space for improvisation. Crews often modified them with heavier guns, scavenged parts, and sometimes even 37mm cannons pulled off aircraft wrecks. But for all their daring design, they had a fatal weakness: they were made of wood. A single shell from a Japanese destroyer could tear through them like paper. Fire was a constant threat. Sailors joked that they were plywood coffins. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, thought in terms of steel giants. Its doctrine emphasized decisive battles fought by fleets of battleships and cruisers, supported by destroyers and carriers. Small, lightly armed craft were seen as insignificant, even laughable. In the years before the war, Japan had not invested heavily in equivalent fast attack boats. This mindset made the appearance of America's PT boats all the more unsettling. To Japanese commanders accustomed to fighting at long range, the idea of small craft darting in close, invisible until it was too late, was alien. They were not designed to counter it. If the boats were fragile, the men who sailed them had to be anything but. PT crews were typically young, many barely out of their teens. They faced dangers not only from the enemy but from the sea itself, storms, reefs, and the constant threat of fire from gasoline-powered engines. Yet the tight-knit crews often described their service as one of the most thrilling experiences of the war. One of the earliest and most famous commanders was Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley, a fiery officer whose daring in the Philippines would earn him the Medal of Honor. He once wrote that the PT boat was the answer to David's sling, a small weapon capable of striking giants. These men had to improvise constantly. Ammunition was scarce. Engines broke down. The torpedoes, crucial to their mission, were often faulty in the early years, failing to detonate or running too deep. Yet the crews pressed on, developing tactics that turned weaknesses into strengths. By 1942, PT boats had formed what some called a navy within the navy. Operating from hidden bases carved into jungle coves, they lived a different war than the great fleets. Their battles were fought at night, often at ranges of a few hundred yards. They stalked Japanese supply barges, ambushed destroyers, and harassed convoys under cover of darkness. Japanese soldiers began calling them roba no mushi, mosquitoes of the night. Small, annoying, but impossible to ignore. But their contribution went beyond tactics. In the early months of the war, when America needed symbols of defiance, the PT boats delivered. They became propaganda tools, proof that even in defeat, U.S. forces could still strike. Perhaps no moment captured this more than the daring evacuation of General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines. Ordered to leave by President Roosevelt, MacArthur was spirited away aboard PT boats commanded by Bulkeley. The journey through Japanese-controlled waters was harrowing, yet successful. MacArthur later declared, "Bulkeley, you've taken me out of the jaws of death, and I won't forget it." The episode turned the PT boats into legends overnight. The Japanese Navy, still basking in victories, could not comprehend why the Americans risked men and resources on such fragile craft. But the truth was that PT boats were not designed to win battles alone. They were weapons of disruption. They denied the Japanese security in waters they thought safe. They forced destroyers and cruisers to divert resources, slowing supply chains that were already stretched thin. In the war of nerves that defined the Pacific, this mattered as much as tonnage sunk. Asterisk: if you're still here, you clearly love history. Stories like this take hours of research, and only a small percentage of viewers ever subscribe. Don't be part of the silent majority. Hitting subscribe takes just 1 second, and it helps keep these World War II stories alive. Asterisk: the Pacific War erupted with fire and smoke at Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, Japan's naval strike crippled much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, leaving battleships burning in the harbor. For the United States, the first months of war were a desperate scramble to hold ground, retreat where necessary, and improvise wherever possible. Nowhere was this desperation clearer than in the Philippines. The islands were strategically vital, the gateway to Southeast Asia, a symbol of American presence in the Pacific, and a target Japan was determined to capture. When Japanese forces swept into Luzon in late December, American and Filipino defenders faced overwhelming odds. In this chaos, the PT boats arrived. Stationed at Cavite Navy Yard near Manila were a handful of the Navy's newest weapons, 6 PT boats of Squadron 3, under the command of Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley. They were sleek, fast, and untested in real combat. To many, they seemed hopeless against the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But Bulkeley was not a man easily discouraged. Aggressive, bold, and with a flair for the dramatic, he saw in his boats a way to strike back. He called them mosquitoes, small but capable of delivering a painful sting. When Cavite was bombed in December 1941, most of the American fleet in the Philippines was destroyed. The PT squadron survived almost by accident, spared by its small size and scattered moorings. Suddenly, these fragile boats became the only American naval offensive power left in the islands. Bulkeley threw them into action. His boats launched nighttime raids against Japanese barges and patrols. They harassed landing craft and torpedoed transports under cover of darkness. On one occasion, PT-34 attacked a Japanese cruiser, claiming a hit before escaping into the night. Though the damage was disputed, the psychological effect was real. Japanese reports began to note these strange little boats that struck suddenly and vanished into the shadows. The disparity was staggering. Japan's invasion force included dozens of warships, carriers, and hundreds of aircraft. The PT squadron had fewer than 100 men and 6 fragile craft. Yet their mere presence forced the Japanese to stay cautious in waters they otherwise controlled. Bulkeley's crews operated on the edge of exhaustion. Fuel was scarce, parts were impossible to find, and the torpedoes often malfunctioned. Sometimes, they carried out missions with barely enough ammunition to fight. But desperation bred innovation. Crews stripped weapons from wrecks, bolted extra guns onto decks, and patched holes with scrap wood. The Japanese saw the boats as reckless, almost suicidal. But that recklessness allowed them to strike where no conventional warship dared to go. By early 1942, the situation in the Philippines had become untenable. Japanese troops had overrun most of Luzon, forcing American and Filipino forces back to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. Army forces in the Far East, had been ordered by President Roosevelt to escape before the Philippines fell. The mission to extract him would become the PT boat's most famous operation. On the night of March 11, 1942, under cover of darkness, 4 PT boats slipped into Manila Bay. Their mission, to carry MacArthur, his family, and his staff through nearly 600 miles of Japanese-controlled waters to safety in Mindanao, from where he would fly to Australia. The risks were immense. Japanese destroyers patrolled the waters. Air cover was impossible. The boats were overloaded with passengers, supplies, and fuel drums lashed to their decks. One hit could ignite a floating inferno. Bulkeley himself commanded PT-41, the lead boat. Engines roared, gasoline fumes filled the air, and the boats surged into the night. For hours, they threaded their way through minefields, dodged patrols, and battled rough seas. At one point, a Japanese destroyer loomed on the horizon, but the PTs slipped away before detection. MacArthur's journey was grueling. He later recalled the pounding seas and the endless tension of expecting an ambush. But the mission succeeded. The general made it safely to Australia, where he declared his famous vow, "I shall return." For Bulkeley and his men, the escape was proof that PT boats were more than suicide craft. They could strike, evade, and carry out missions that no other vessel could attempt. The story electrified America. Newspapers hailed the PT boats as symbols of resilience in the face of defeat. President Roosevelt awarded Bulkeley the Medal of Honor. The boats became legends overnight, fast, daring, and uniquely American. The Japanese, meanwhile, were baffled. Their intelligence reports acknowledged the presence of the PT boats but could not understand why the Americans risked so much on such flimsy craft. To a navy built on steel giants, the idea of trusting plywood boats in combat was incomprehensible. And yet, the sting was real. Even when the boats failed to sink major warships, they disrupted supply runs, forced caution, and kept alive the spirit of resistance. In the Philippines, where nearly all else was lost, the PT boats proved that America was not finished fighting. Think of how much effort went into uncovering this part of history. These stories take hours of digging into archives and first-hand accounts. If you want to support more untold World War II stories like this, subscribing means everything. Please don't let these stories disappear into the algorithm. By the time the Philippines finally fell in May 1942, most of Bulkeley's boats were gone, lost to battle, scuttled to prevent capture, or simply worn out. But their legend had only begun. The PT boats would now move on to the next great arena of the Pacific War, the Solomon Islands. There, in waters haunted by Japanese destroyers and convoys, they would become the phantoms of the night. The fall of the Philippines was a bitter defeat. General MacArthur had escaped, but tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops were captured, and the islands lay firmly in Japanese hands. Yet the PT boats had proved their worth in those desperate months. Now, the Navy sought to use them on a much larger stage. That stage was the Solomon Islands, a long, jagged chain of jungle-clad islands stretching across the South Pacific. Whoever controlled them would control the sea lanes to Australia, and thus the future of the war. In August 1942, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal. For 6 brutal months, the island became a killing ground. The U.S. Navy and Imperial Japanese Navy fought some of the most savage naval battles in history. And into this maelstrom came the PT boats. By late 1942, squadrons of PT boats were operating out of bases hacked from the jungle in Tulagi and later Rendova. Their mission: to intercept Japanese supply convoys, the so-called Tokyo Express. The Tokyo Express was the lifeline of Japanese troops fighting on Guadalcanal. Destroyers, cruisers, and barges dashed down the slot, the narrow waters between the islands, under cover of night. Fast and heavily armed, they could deliver men and supplies quickly before retreating at dawn. The PT boats were ordered to stop them. The matchup was almost absurd. Japanese destroyers displaced 2,000 tons and bristled with guns. A PT boat weighed just 50 tons and was made of plywood. A single hit could obliterate it. Yet the PTs had one advantage: surprise. The PTs prowled the narrow waters like wolves, engines thundering, crews straining their eyes in the dark for the faint silhouette of a Japanese ship. When a target was sighted, they would race in at 40 knots, unleash torpedoes, and then veer away under machine gun fire. Sometimes the battles were over in seconds, sometimes they became prolonged chases through black waters lit only by tracer fire. One Japanese officer later described the PT boats as phantoms of the night, seen for a moment, striking with torpedoes, then gone. But success was far from guaranteed. The Mark 8 torpedoes the points carried were notoriously unreliable. Many ran too deep, veered off course, or failed to detonate. Crews risked everything to deliver attacks that sometimes fizzled into nothing. One commander lamented, "We risked our lives on a coin toss, whether the torpedo would run or not." The cost was high. Japanese destroyers carried rapid-firing 5-inch guns that could obliterate a PT in a single volley. Machine guns stitched their decks with fire. In one desperate action, PT-109 sister boat PT-37 was riddled with shells and exploded in a sheet of flame. Survivors leapt into shark-infested waters, clinging to debris until dawn. Yet the boats kept coming. In dozens of night battles, they harassed the Tokyo Express relentlessly. They rarely sank destroyers outright, but they forced the Japanese to zigzag, delay, and divert resources. More importantly, they slowed the resupply effort to Guadalcanal. Japanese soldiers on the island began to starve. The PTs also adapted. When torpedoes failed, they turned to ambushes of supply barges. These barges, loaded with food and ammunition, were slow and vulnerable. Crews dubbed these missions barge busting. Machine guns and cannons ripped into the wooden craft, sending supplies and soldiers into the sea. For the hungry Marines on Guadalcanal, every barge destroyed meant fewer bullets and rations reaching the enemy. For the PT crews, life was a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. They lived in rough jungle bases, constantly plagued by malaria, heat, and rain. Engines required endless maintenance. Missions went out night after night with little rest. And yet, many recalled it as the most intense and unforgettable experience of their lives. Bonds between crew members were unbreakable. They were a small navy within the navy, outsiders compared to battleship sailors, but proud of their unique role. Some sailors carved nicknames into their boats, painted shark mouths on bows, and turned their fragile craft into symbols of defiance. One sailor wrote in his diary, "Every night we lived or died together. That was the bargain." We wouldn't have had it any other way. The Japanese Navy, accustomed to duels with cruisers and battleships, struggled to counter the PTs. Destroyer captains despised the boats. Reports described them as annoying pests, but pests that forced constant vigilance. A Japanese diary captured the frustration: "They come at night, like biting insects. You swat one, another appears. They are reckless, foolish, yet they do not stop. Our men curse them, but they are afraid of them too." For a navy already stretched to its limit, the psychological toll was as damaging as the material one. The PTs were rewriting the rules of the night war. By 1943, the PT squadrons had learned hard lessons. Torpedo runs against fast destroyers often failed. Instead, they shifted focus to ambushing barges and patrol boats, where their speed and firepower gave them the edge. Crews mounted heavier weapons, 20mm cannons, 37mm guns, even salvaged aircraft guns. The boats became floating arsenals, bristling with improvised firepower. These changes made them even more dangerous in close combat. Japanese barge crews soon dreaded the sight of PT boats roaring out of the darkness, guns blazing. But the price never grew smaller. Crews were killed, boats shredded by shells, and survivors left adrift for days. Sharks prowled the waters, claiming men who had escaped burning wrecks. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion took their toll even when the enemy was absent. One commander later admitted, "We lost more to the ocean and sickness than to enemy fire. But the enemy never forgot us." As the Guadalcanal campaign dragged on, the PT boats became one of many factors that bled the Japanese dry. Destroyed barges, disrupted convoys, and sleepless nights added up. By February 1943, Japan abandoned the island. It was a turning point in the war. The PT boats had not won Guadalcanal alone. Aircraft carriers, marines, and submarines carried the heaviest burden. But the Mosquito fleet had played its part. They proved that even plywood craft, in the right hands, could shape a campaign. If you've watched this far, you're part of a tiny group of people who care about these hidden stories of World War II. Only a fraction of viewers ever subscribe, and without your support, stories like this vanish. Don't let that happen. Subscribing keeps them alive. By mid-1943, the PT boats had cemented their place in the Pacific War. They had blooded themselves against the Tokyo Express, adapted to new missions, and earned both respect and hatred from the enemy. But their most famous chapter was yet to come. In the narrow waters of the Solomons, one PT boat would meet disaster and its young commander would later become President of the United States. By 1943, the Mosquito fleet had carved out its reputation. Japanese sailors cursed them, American commanders praised them, and their crews bore the scars of relentless night warfare. Yet the PT boats were still underestimated. To many, they were a sideshow, a distraction in a war decided by carriers and bombers. That perception would change with a single incident in the Solomon Islands, an event that would etch the letters PT-109 into history. The boat was commanded by a young lieutenant named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Barely 26 years old, the son of a powerful political family, Kennedy was determined to prove himself in the crucible of war. He had volunteered for PT duty, drawn by the promise of action and responsibility. His crew, a tight band of 12 men, soon learned that their skipper was calm under pressure, soft-spoken, but resolute. On the night of August 1, 1943, PT-109 was one of 15 boats sent to intercept Japanese destroyers in Blackhead Strait. The mission was dangerous but routine: lurk in the darkness, fire torpedoes at the Tokyo Express, and escape before retaliation. Kennedy and his men waited in the shadows, engines idling. The night was moonless, visibility poor. Suddenly, out of the gloom, a massive shape loomed. It was the Japanese destroyer Amajiri, bearing down at full speed. Kennedy ordered evasive action, but there was no time. In an instant, steel met plywood. The destroyer plowed through PT-109, splitting it in two. A fireball erupted, hurling men into the sea. When the flames subsided, half the crew were dead or clinging to wreckage. For Kennedy, the nightmare had only begun. Hours passed as the survivors drifted in shark-infested waters. Kennedy swam from man to man, encouraging them, refusing to abandon anyone. With a rope clenched in his teeth, he towed a wounded sailor for miles through rough seas. At dawn, the survivors clambered onto a tiny coral island. Exhausted, hungry, and exposed, they faced a grim reality: they were stranded deep in enemy waters. For nearly a week, Kennedy led his men in a desperate fight for survival. They swam between islands, searching for food and fresh water. He carved messages into coconuts, hoping native scouts might find them. One message, scrawled in shaky letters, would eventually reach Allied forces: "Nauru is Navy 11 alive, need small boat." It was enough. With the help of Solomon Islander scouts, the crew was rescued. Kennedy's leadership, his refusal to give in, his determination to save every man he could, turned disaster into legend. The PT-109 story raced across America. Newspapers hailed Kennedy as a hero. In the grim summer of 1943, it was a tale of courage the nation hungered for. For the PT boats, it was vindication. No longer could they be dismissed as irrelevant. They were the stage on which future leaders proved themselves, the crucible where American grit outshone steel. The Japanese, for their part, scarcely registered the incident. For them, ramming a flimsy patrol boat was nothing unusual. But they underestimated how much symbolic power these small battles carried. To the United States, Kennedy's survival was more than a footnote. It was a reminder that even in the shadows, even against overwhelming odds, the Mosquito fleet could inspire a nation. While PT-109 captured headlines, the wider war for the Solomons continued. PT squadrons adapted further, focusing on the Japanese supply barges that kept isolated garrisons alive. Destroyers were too valuable to waste on such missions, so barges carried food and ammunition by night. But the PT boats were waiting. Armed with 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns, they ripped into the wooden craft at close range, slaughtering cargo and crew alike. The fighting grew brutal. These were knife fights on the water, boats closing to within yards, tracers sparking across black waves, men shouting over the roar of engines and gunfire. Japanese barge crews fought back with rifles and machine guns. Some PT boats were shredded by return fire, set ablaze, or blown apart. Survivors often drifted for days, clinging to wreckage, their bodies battered by the sea. But the campaign worked. Japanese forces on island outposts began to wither. Starvation spread, morale crumbled, and the Mosquito fleet's sting grew sharper. By 1944, the PT boats had reached their high point. Squadrons operated across the Pacific, New Guinea, the Solomons, the Philippines. They hunted barges, ambushed convoys, and supported invasions. Their numbers swelled into the hundreds. They were no longer experimental. They were essential. Japanese accounts reveal both frustration and reluctant respect. One officer wrote bitterly, "They are not warships. They are pests. But they steal our strength, drop by drop, night by night." Another admitted, "They do not fear death. They rush us even when outnumbered. They are not normal men." For the American crews, this was validation. They had taken a weapon dismissed by admirals as useless and turned it into a symbol of daring. They had proven that plywood boats, in the right hands, could terrorize a navy built on steel. The legend of the PT boats was now secure. They had carried generals to safety, stalked destroyers in the night, and shaped the outcome of campaigns by sheer persistence. But every legend carries its price. Hundreds of sailors never came home, their boats lost to the depths. Wooden hulls left little trace. For many families, the ocean became the only grave. Still, the Mosquito fleet pressed on, knowing their war was far from over. Soon, they would return to the Philippines, to the very islands where their story had begun. And once again, the Japanese would feel their sting. Think of how much research it takes to tell these stories in detail. If you're still watching, you're one of the few who truly values history. Please subscribe, it's the best way to ensure these sacrifices and stories are never forgotten. By the end of 1943, the PT boats had reached the height of their fame. They were no longer an experiment, no longer a desperate gamble. They were proven weapons of disruption, tools of psychological warfare, and symbols of American resolve. But the war was shifting. Japan was weakening, its navy battered, its supplies dwindling. As the tide turned, the Mosquito fleet would find itself fighting not for glory, but to finish the job it had started. The climax had passed. What remained was resolution. The tide of war was shifting. By early 1944, Japan's once vast empire was shrinking under the relentless pressure of Allied offensives. Carrier battles had bled the Imperial Navy, submarines strangled its supply lines, and air raids battered its bases. Into this crumbling perimeter surged the Mosquito fleet, its plywood hulls prowling the night, striking where Japan could least afford to be struck. When General Douglas MacArthur prepared his long-promised return to the Philippines, the PT boats played a role far greater than their size suggested. They ferried scouts to hidden beaches, reconnoitered landing zones, and guarded the flanks of invasion forces. They became the eyes and ears of the Navy, slipping into shallow waters where destroyers dared not tread. For the men who served aboard, the war was becoming more dangerous than ever. The Japanese, desperate and cornered, fought back with a ferocity born of survival. One PT veteran recalled in his memoir, "It was no longer a game of ambush and escape. Every patrol felt like a suicide run. The Japanese would fire everything they had. We were hit more times than I can count, but somehow we kept going." Such words echo the reality of late 1944. The Mosquito fleet had matured into hardened hunters, but the cost of victory was mounting. At Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of the war, PT boats were thrust into history's spotlight once again. On October 23, 1944, as Admiral Kurita's massive Japanese center force steamed toward the San Bernardino Strait, PT squadrons were the first to make contact. Radar blips became looming shadows, and then the sea itself erupted in gunfire. Outgunned and outmatched, the PTs attacked anyway, firing torpedoes into the dark and radioing frantic warnings to the fleet. The torpedoes missed, but the message got through. Thanks to those Mosquito boats, American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. That early warning altered deployments, shaping the desperate battles that followed. In Leyte Gulf's chaos, PT boats darted between leviathans, carriers, battleships, cruisers, like minnows in a shark tank. They carried wounded men to safety, shielded landing craft from barges, and harassed retreating destroyers. It was their finest hour, though few would remember it among the titanic clashes of carriers and battleships. For the Japanese, the Philippines campaign was a slow death. Their barges, once the lifeline to garrisons, became death traps. PT boats hunted them ruthlessly, gunning them down in coves and estuaries, leaving survivors to the mercy of the sea. The impact was devastating. Cut off from supplies, Japanese soldiers starved in the jungles, reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and, in some cases, each other. It was a war of attrition waged not by mighty fleets, but by fragile boats with plywood hulls and crews who refused to yield. Still, the dangers never waned. Kamikaze attacks, artillery bombardments, and ambushes claimed many PT crews. Wooden decks offered no protection against shrapnel. Fires spread quickly, explosions came without warning. A single shell could turn a patrol into a massacre. Yet the volunteers kept coming, young men eager to prove themselves, lured by the promise of action and the tight-knit brotherhood of small crews. By 1945, the Mosquito fleet had become a legend. They had escorted General MacArthur ashore at Leyte. They had stalked Japanese shipping from New Guinea to Borneo. And now, as the war's end approached, they prowled the waters off Okinawa and Luzon, still striking, still haunting. But their purpose was fading. With Japan's navy shattered and its skies dominated by American bombers, the PT boats had fewer targets left. Their missions shifted to harassment and mop-up. They landed guerrillas on Japanese-held islands, delivered supplies to resistance fighters, and intercepted what little enemy traffic remained. The once vast challenge of hunting destroyers had given way to the grim duty of strangling a dying empire. In Tokyo, Japanese naval officers reviewed reports of PT attacks with a mix of contempt and despair. Some dismissed them as gnats, insignificant irritants in a war of giants. Others admitted their effectiveness, noting how barges were annihilated and troops starved because of the relentless patrols. One after-action report grimly acknowledged, "These boats, though unworthy of being called warships, are the blade that cuts the arteries of our empire." It was a reluctant recognition that Japan had been humbled not just by carriers and battleships, but by small craft armed with courage. For the sailors themselves, the end of the war brought relief mixed with unease. Many had lived through experiences too harrowing to ever forget, nights adrift on wreckage, comrades lost in sudden explosions, battles fought at point-blank range. The return to civilian life would never erase the sound of engines roaring in the dark, or the memory of tracers hissing across the waves. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, hundreds of PT boats lay scattered across the Pacific, their missions complete. Many were burned or scuttled, considered too flimsy and obsolete for peacetime use. A few survived as training vessels or museum relics, monuments to an era when America's secret weapon was nothing more than plywood, gasoline, and fearless men. The immediate aftermath of the war revealed the true measure of their impact. Japanese garrisons collapsed not only because of bombing and blockades but because PT boats had cut off their lifelines. In campaign after campaign, from the Solomons to the Philippines, the Mosquito fleet had delivered death by 1,000 stings. They had forced the enemy to expend resources on escorts, patrols, and countermeasures, all while operating at a fraction of the cost of larger warships. In the silence that followed the guns of 1945, the PT boats faded into history's shadows. They had never been glamorous like the carriers, never decisive like the submarines. But for those who knew, they had been indispensable. They had proven that in war, ingenuity and daring could triumph over brute force. And yet, the legend endured. Veterans told their stories, sometimes in bars, sometimes in books. A few became famous, like John F. Kennedy, whose wartime service propelled him to the presidency. But most remained anonymous, their deeds remembered only by those who served beside them. Wooden boats, wooden crosses, and fading memories marked their legacy. Still, the image of those small, dark silhouettes cutting through black water under the Pacific moon became a symbol. A symbol of improvisation, of resolve, of striking from the shadows when nothing else could. Asterisk: if you're still here, it means you truly care about keeping history alive. Only a small fraction of viewers ever subscribe. Don't let these stories vanish into the algorithm. Subscribe now and help keep the memory of these forgotten sailors afloat. Asterisk: the guns of the Pacific had fallen silent, but the legacy of the Mosquito fleet lingered. In the wreckage of war, the world took stock of what had worked, what had failed, and what had changed the very nature of naval combat. Among the towering carriers and majestic battleships, the small, humble PT boat left a shadow far greater than its size. The first consequence was technological. The war had proven the value of speed, maneuverability, and mass production. PT boats were not marvels of engineering like aircraft carriers, they were practical machines, designed to be built quickly and in great numbers. The lesson resonated in navies worldwide. Post-war fleets embraced fast attack craft, torpedo boats, and missile-equipped patrol vessels, all spiritual descendants of the plywood warriors. In many ways, the PT boats foreshadowed the age of asymmetrical naval warfare, where small, inexpensive platforms could threaten ships 100 times their size. The second consequence was psychological. For the Japanese, the memory of PT boats was bitter. Diaries and reports revealed how demoralizing it was to face an enemy that seemed to materialize from the dark, strike with ferocity, and vanish before retaliation. They were reminders that no corner of the Pacific was safe, that even the shallowest lagoon or narrowest strait could harbor danger. This constant anxiety wore down Japanese morale, compounding the exhaustion of a war already stretching beyond endurance. For the Americans, the PT boats became a symbol of ingenuity and daring. They were proof that the underdog could triumph, that small teams could tilt the course of campaigns. This narrative fit neatly into the post-war self-image of the United States as a nation that had won not just through industrial might, but through courage and innovation. Stories of PT patrols appeared in newspapers, magazines, and eventually films, ensuring that their exploits were not forgotten. The third consequence was personal. The most famous PT officer, John F. Kennedy, carried the lessons of PT 109 into his political career. His survival and leadership under fire became a cornerstone of his public image, a story retold in campaign ads, books, and even a Hollywood film. When Kennedy ran for president in 1960, voters saw not just a young senator, but the skipper who had carried a wounded man through shark-infested waters, the leader who had refused to abandon his crew. In that sense, the Mosquito fleet helped shape the destiny of an entire nation. But beyond Kennedy, thousands of PT veterans returned home, carrying their own quieter lessons. They had learned the value of trust, teamwork, and improvisation under pressure. Many built successful careers in business, politics, and public service, often crediting their wartime service with instilling the confidence to lead. The boats themselves were gone, burned on beaches or scuttled in lagoons, but the men who sailed them carried their spirit into the fabric of post-war America. For historians, the PT boats offer a striking case study in the dynamics of war. They reveal how weapons dismissed as trivial can reshape strategies when used creatively. They show how morale, logistics, and persistence can erode even the strongest adversary. And they remind us that history is not only written by great fleets and grand battles, but by the men in small boats who fought night after night in obscurity. There was also a cultural legacy. The image of the PT boat, low, sleek, darting across moonlit waters, became romanticized in books, television shows, and films. Series like McHale's Navy offered a comedic spin, while war dramas portrayed the danger and camaraderie of the Mosquito fleet with more seriousness. These depictions ensured that even generations who never saw war would know the outline of their story, if not always its full truth. Yet there was an irony in their legacy. By the 1950s, advances in jet aircraft and guided missiles rendered wooden torpedo boats obsolete. No modern navy would fight in exactly the same way again. But the principle they embodied, using speed and surprise to offset weakness, remained timeless. In the Cold War, missile boats of the Soviet Union and fast attack craft of NATO echoed their philosophy. Even in today's conflicts, the idea survives in small naval craft used for hit-and-run tactics in literal waters. The Mosquito fleet never truly died, it merely changed form. For Japan, the memory of PT boats became part of a larger reflection on defeat. In post-war memoirs, some officers dismissed them as annoyances, refusing to grant them the dignity of being decisive. Others admitted their role in strangling supply lines and isolating garrisons. But for the ordinary Japanese soldier stranded on an island without food, the impact was undeniable. To them, the loss of supply barges meant slow starvation. In that sense, the sting of the PT boat was as lethal as any bombing campaign. As decades passed, the islands of the Pacific kept their secrets. Rusting engines, decayed hulls, and scattered debris of PT boats still lie in shallow waters and hidden coves. Divers who find them often describe a haunting silence, as if the sea itself remembers. Each wreck is a tomb, a reminder of young men who gave their lives in fragile boats to fight a vast empire. For the United States Navy, the PT boats became a lesson in adaptability. They had been rushed into service, criticized for design flaws, and nearly scrapped as a failed experiment. Yet under the pressure of war, they found their purpose. Their story reminds us that victory often comes not from perfection, but from perseverance. In a conflict as vast as World War II, even the smallest weapons could bend the arc of history. And so, the extended consequences of the PT boats stretch far beyond the Pacific War. They shaped naval doctrine, inspired future leaders, influenced culture, and left behind a legend that endures. They remind us that innovation often begins in desperation, that courage often resides in the smallest of crews, and that even in the darkest nights, striking from the shadows can change the fate of nations. Think of how much effort it takes to preserve stories like this, research, writing, and storytelling that few people ever see through to the end. If you've come this far, you're one of the rare viewers who truly values history. Please, take 1 second to subscribe. It's the best way to make sure these sacrifices are remembered. The war ended, but the echoes of the Mosquito fleet still ripple across history. In the vast Pacific, where carriers clashed and battleships thundered, it was the smallest of vessels that left some of the deepest scars. They were made of plywood, powered by gasoline engines that roared like angry beasts, and manned by crews who were barely more than boys. Yet they struck fear into an empire and carved themselves a place in legend. The Japanese never expected such boats to matter. They were supposed to be irrelevant, swept aside by steel and firepower. But night after night, the PT boats proved that size and might are not always the measure of strength. They showed that audacity, persistence, and imagination could tip the balance of war. In their wake lay sunken barges, disrupted supply lines, and shattered moral victories won not with overwhelming force, but with relentless daring. For the men who sailed them, the memories never faded. The black ocean, the smell of burning fuel, the crack of machine guns cutting through the night, these stayed with them long after the war. Some carried scars on their bodies, others carried them in silence. All carried the knowledge that they had fought not in the grand spotlight of history, but in the shadows, where their contribution was easy to overlook. Yet their story endures. It endures because courage has a way of outlasting the machines it animates. It endures because history remembers not just the giants, but the gnats that stung them into weakness. And it endures because among those Mosquito boats was a young lieutenant named Kennedy, whose survival and heroism would one day shape the course of the free world. In the end, the PT boats remind us of a simple truth: even the smallest weapons, in the hands of the determined, can alter the fate of nations. They remind us that the shadows of war are often where the most remarkable stories unfold. And they remind us that sometimes, the sound of plywood cutting through black water can echo louder than the guns of battleships. If you believe these stories must never fade, then subscribe. Otherwise, the memory of these men risks vanishing into silence, just as their boats vanished beneath the waves. And so, the tale of America's secret PT boats comes to an end. Born of desperation, doubted by their own admirals, they became the silent hunters of the Pacific. They were fragile, imperfect, and often underestimated, yet their sting helped bleed an empire dry. Their legacy is not measured in tonnage sunk or battles won. It is measured in the spirit they embodied. In the darkness of war, they proved that courage could be louder than fear, that ingenuity could overcome limitation, and that even the smallest craft could shape the course of history. Most of those boats now rest at the bottom of the sea, their wooden hulls claimed by time. But the men who crewed them live on in memory, not as forgotten sailors, but as proof of what determination can achieve against overwhelming odds. The Mosquito fleet struck from the shadows. Today, it asks us to remember not just the grand strategies of war, but the human stories written in fire and salt water. To forget them is to lose a piece of what it meant to fight, to endure, and to prevail. Subscribe, share, and keep their memory alive. History only endures if we choose to carry it forward.